How much do you know about exposure and the things in your camera that control the exposure? Meaning how bright or how dark your pictures turn out? And why should you even worry about these things? You could just put the camera in automatic or program mode and point and shoot. A lot of people do that and they take great pictures. Even a lot of professional photographers do that and take great pictures. But when you do that, you're going to leave some of the decision making up to the camera, and the camera might decide to expose things like you would have done it, or it might not. Chances are it's not going to make the same decisions that you would have made. So I think it's a good idea to know these things in your camera that control the exposure, because that will give you greater opportunity to control the outcome of your photography. Now, the three things in your camera that control the exposure are the aperture, which is the opening or the hole that lets light in, the size of the opening that lets light into your camera. The shutter, which is sort of the door that opens and closes to let light in, and how long this is open. And the ISO, which used to be the sensitivity of the film that you put in the camera, but it's, if you use a digital camera, it's now the sensitivity of the imaging sensor in your camera. And these three things work together in a wonderful way, in that they correlate to each other perfectly. They're measured in stops, and if you change one of these things one stop, then you can change another thing one stop the other way, and you're sort of back to where you started in terms of how bright or how dark your pictures turn out. Now, they will affect the outcome of the picture differently though. So even if they all sort of work together to get the brightness and darkness right, and they correlate in that sense, the outcome will be different depending on if you change the aperture, or if you change the shutter, or if you change the ISO. So if we start with the aperture is the size of the opening. Like I said, it's in the lens, and it's measured in f-stops. And a smaller f-stop number will describe a larger opening. So an F number of 2.8 will be a rather large opening, whereas an aperture or f22 will be a really small opening. And the range available to you will be determined by your lens. So it's basically when you buy your lens that you determine what f-stops are going to be available to you when you shoot. So if you buy a prime lens, then you're going to have a larger available f-stop probably. And if you have a zoom lens, your largest aperture is going to be smaller. And also if you have a more expensive lens, you're probably going to have, particularly that when it comes to zoom lenses, if you have a more expensive lens, you might have a larger available aperture. Now it's kind of weird because the larger the aperture, the smaller the f number, and the opposite. So if you have a really small aperture, the f number will be larger. But it's basically because it's not really the whole number, it's actually a fraction, so it's 1 over 2.8, for example. So in the case with this lens, it starts at 2.8. That's the largest opening, the largest aperture, and the smallest number. And then it's measured in whole stops. It would be the next whole stop would be aperture 4. The next whole stop again would be 5.6. The next would be 8. The next would be 11. The next would be 16, and so on. And of course, most modern cameras, they will give you the option to change only like thirds of stops. So between every stop there will be 2 third stops, so to speak. But if we for now keep to the whole stops, those are the whole stops. And technically we would start at 1, although I've never seen that in an actual lens. But the next one would be 1.4, the next one would be 2, and so on. And each larger aperture will let in twice the amount of light, and each smaller aperture would let in half the amount of light. So you double or you half. And the way that the aperture affects your final picture is, apart from it makes it brighter or darker, it affects the depth of field in your picture. So if you have 2 subjects in the same photo and they're at different distances from the camera, then if you have a large opening, your depth of field is going to be more shallow, and you're only going to be able to have one of the subjects in focus at the same time. If you want them both to be in focus, you will have to make the f number larger and the opening smaller, and then that's going to increase your depth of field. The next thing, which is the shutter, is the length of time that the door that lets the light in remains open. So you have the size of the door, and now it's a question of how long the door is going to be open to let light in. So, and the shutter speed is the same as the aperture, in the sense that the next stop will allow twice the amount of light in, or half the amount of light in. So it's going to correspond perfectly to the aperture in that sense. And it's measured in time, and usually on the one end it will be sort of limited by the camera as how fast your shutter can be. I think an 8,000th of a second is probably the fastest many cameras can go, but I think it's rare that you would need anything faster than that. And on the other side, it's in theory limitless. You could have a shutter speed that's as long as you want, a week, or an hour, a minute. However, as long as you're handheld, there's definitely going to be a limit to how long you can have your shutter speed without the picture being totally blurry. And that amount of time is going to vary depending on what lens you use. So if you're using a longer lens, a longer focal length lens, then you're going to need a shorter shutter speed, because a longer lens are going to make the movements larger, since you're not going to be able to stand 100% still. And a shorter lens, you're not going to see the movements as much, so you can get away with the longer shutter speed. And the reason why you want to be in control of the shutter speed is, well, first of all, to get your pictures sharp like you want them, but also to control motion blurriness in other ways. Like sometimes you might want motion blur, like if you take pictures of a fast car and you have a really short shutter speed, well, it's going to look like the car is just standing still, because you're going to freeze the motion, because the amount of time that the shutter is open, the car is just sort of in one place. Whereas if you want it to be, you probably see in those pictures where the background is all going sort of sideways, and you get the car in focus, but you really get the speed in the picture, then you need a shutter speed that's a little bit longer. On the other hand, if you want water splash, or you want a person jumping or something, and you want the action to be frozen mid-air, then you need a shutter speed that's really fast, a short shutter speed, so to speak. Now you have those two things that control the amount of light you let into the camera, that control the depth of field and the motion blurriness. Now the last component is the ISO, which is the sensitivity. And in a lot of cases you could sort of use the other two and put them where you want it, and then you can sort of just put the ISO where it needs to be to get the right exposure. However, the ISO will affect the outcome in its own way, in that the higher the ISO number, the more sensitive and the less light you need, the more grainy the final picture is going to be, or more noisy. Grain was the word you used for film back in the day, or now if you use film, but for most people now we talk about noise. That's what you get from the image sensor. When you have a high ISO, you get more noise. And sometimes I think the noise can be sort of a cool effect. You get the sort of a, like the newsy picture, like here's stuff going on and this is like the real world and stuff. But it's good to know that when you raise the ISO, you're going to get more noise. And I think it's always best to use as low ISO as you can, because you can always add noise in Photoshop if you want it, whereas it's harder to get rid of, even though there are ways to reduce noise in post-production. It's much easier if you don't have it in the first place. So these are the three things that control your exposure in the camera. And now that you know what they are, you should practice using them. You should play around with them to where you get a feel for how they affect your pictures, and so where you sort of get a feel for it at any moment. You kind of know what you want to change, because most of the times, in my experience, your settings will actually be a compromise, whereas you never have enough light for the picture that you want. So you're going to have to work with these three things to get the best possible result. But not rarely I have to put my ISO higher than I would like. I have to put the shutter at longer than I would like, and I have to put the aperture on a larger opening than I would like. But it's knowing what you can change, how much you can change it, and to sort of be in control of your outcome. You're going to know what the result is going to be. So practice it and have fun.